Hello, my name is Lauren Kisan. I'm the organizer of Disruptive Technologists. I want to welcome you to our very casual quarterly webinar. Today we will discuss tech disrupts democracy. We only have 1 hour, so we'll probably won't be able to go through all our points, but we will hold another webinar on the same topic in a few months to cover more on the subject of technology. Next, I want to welcome Sep DiMeglio, the UX and accessibility customer engineer at Microsoft. Have fun, everyone.
Sure. Yep. So we just wanted to give a couple of quick shout outs. One, first off to Zeotag for our special tagged videos. When these get recorded and sent out, Zeotag kind of shows some quick tagging so that you could jump around the video, see some cool topics and things like that. Then Esther Dyson for supporting the Disruptive Technologists monthly newsletter. The Microsoft Reactor for supporting Disruptive Tech's missions. Upflex and Upflex offices actually has some giveaways that they're doing. There's 5 webinar attendees. They're going to get a 2-day free pass to use one of the global office spaces. They're going to be randomly picked from attendees who send their email addresses into either info@disruptivetechnologists.com or directly to the Disruptive Technologists organizer on our meetup site. And then they're going to randomly select it and get some winners. And then finally, Hintwater for kind of being a longtime supporter as well. And then just a quick special or shout out to the fact that we're going to have a fireside chat where attendees can ask questions. And the meetup is actually going to be posted on the meetup site tomorrow. And it'll take place exactly a week from today at 6 p.m. on January 20th. And I think that's it. I'm going to hand it off to our awesome moderator for the night, Oliver Christie.
Hello, thank you. Thank you and welcome to Disruptive Technologists. Tech disrupts democracy. It's been a hell of a week, a hell of a 4 years. So how do we get some answers? I thought this time I'd start with a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which seems appropriate. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. It seems like we are currently destroying ourselves. With that in mind, I would like the panelists for tonight to all quickly introduce themselves, and we'll get to the first question. Why don't we start with Richard?
Hi, my name is Richard Hill, and I am CEO of VoteOurVoice. VoteOurVoice is a company where we give all people a free report card on their politicians.
Fantastic. Misha.
Hi, Micah Sifry. I am the co-founder of Civic Hall and its former president, and longtime curator of Personal Democracy Forum.
Jess?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Riegel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Motivote. Motivote is a civic engagement platform that uses behavioral nudges to help organizations increase civic engagement and voter turnout.
Fantastic, thank you. Bruce.
Which one?
We'll go with you, go for it.
Okay, thank you. My name's Bruce Backenheimer. I'm a full-time clinical professor of management at Pace University. I'm the executive director of our entrepreneurship lab in downtown Manhattan, and I'm a long-time affiliate, board member, whatever, of Disruptive Technologists of New York City.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And last and certainly not least, Tristan.
Hi, Tristan Lewis. I'm a serial entrepreneur, currently president and CEO of Casebook PBC, and I've been an activist also at the intersection of technology and politics for the last 25 plus years.
Fantastic, well, thank you all so much. And let's start with the first question of the night. The last 4 years have been dramatic. The last week has been unprecedented. We've now got a president who's being impeached for the second time. My question is, were we always going to get to this point? Was it inevitable? What would the founding fathers be saying about this week? And lastly, did you realize the quote that was widely shared on Facebook was actually fake? Tristan, why don't we start with you?
So how did we get here? Well, I mean, when you think about the power of the internet and the trends that have been happening in terms of our politics, I think what we've seen is there's been an increasing sorting of people across political denominations into their own kind of bubbles, where the speech and perception have been largely separated into two different approaches to the world. The current president has been taking advantage of this all the way into the White House, and then for the past 4 years as a way to govern. And he's been, sadly, the first internet president. And what I mean by that, he's managed to bypass all the filters that exist in our society through the media, the podium, et cetera, and has gone directly to his supporters and talked directly to his supporters through tools like Twitter and generally the internet to reach out.
Bruce, did you think we were always going to get to this point? If you look back, say, 4.5 years ago, could you imagine this week's events happening?
It's hard to imagine what actually happened on the Capitol, but I go back there. There's an expression that I never liked. Perception is more important than reality. I'm like, reality is reality. Reality is what's important. But clearly, we've seen that people's perception, regardless, or as Josh Hawley would say, irregardless of the amount of evidence presented. I mean, on Facebook, you'll see, well, I don't care. That's what I believe. And, why is that? Where did critical thinking end? Where did education end? Maybe that's a whole different topic, but this idea that people aren't interested in truth or reality or facts, it's what I believe, it's what I feel. And that has gone so far. One of the arguments that was given why we should contest the election is 39% of Americans believe that it was stolen. Well, 39% of Americans roughly believe that the moon landing was faked. And so should we have an investigation on that? 25% actually believe that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun rotates around it. And I don't know, I've worked in about 25 countries, traveled to over 60. Some of the absolute brightest minds in the world are from this country, many of them immigrants, but also some of the most, ignorant. And what do you do? And how do we get back to truth, facts, critical thinking, empirical evidence, et cetera?
Jess, critical thinking, do you think it's needed now more than ever?
Yes, I certainly don't think that a lack of focus on media literacy and critical thinking is the only driver, right? But I will say, been increasingly concerned about the sort of lack of clear sources of truth and trust from my experiences most recently on the Clubhouse app. I don't know if other folks have discovered this yet. It's for like the hot new Silicon Valley. It's an audio app, so you can drop into different conversations. There's some audio only rooms that are 5 people. There's some that are 3,000 people. And over the past couple of weeks, I've spent a lot of time listening into different rooms on different topics, because I think it's a really fascinating way to get insights into something that is not my lived experience. And the amount of disinformation about right, basic scientific facts around the vaccine, around there's been charges of like anti-Semitism on there. I've heard, Holocaust denial, right? And the lack of ability for people to kind of step in or critically unpack. And when people try to do pushback, it's like, well, that's what I heard, or that's what I read on Facebook. And I think in, the proliferation of different forms of communication and media that are in a sense, almost bouncing off each other, right? I saw this on Facebook, so it's real. I Googled it, so it's real. Now I'm talking about it in front of a room of 2,000 people, and therefore it's real. And it's really, really scary to me. I will let somebody who is an expert in the media literacy space talk about how we can solve and address. But I will say, as a citizen and also as a former educator, I started my career as a first grade teacher. The lack of ability to think critically and question is something that is concerning.
Are you finding you're going to new sources of information that you think are more accurate, more trustworthy, or are you going back to more established organizations? Where are you getting your news from?
Me personally? I get a lot of my news from Twitter. So I curate my feed so that I'm following a lot of the journalists that I would, might be going straight to NewYorkTimes.com. And, a couple other news sources I've sort of always used, like Slate. And those, so I wouldn't say that my sources of where I trust information are changing, but I find myself increasingly curious about what are the information diets of people outside my specific experience, which also sometimes includes flipping on Fox News and freaking out for 5 minutes and having to turn it off. Sure. But I do feel like I have a much better understanding of sort of the cognitive dissonance that is occurring, why it's occurring, and how people are being inculcated into that.
Misha, how did you expect this week to arrive? I mean, you've been following politics for a long time, quite deeply. Did you think we'd end up at this point?
I'm actually surprised how long it took to get to this point. I think the most important thing about this moment is the number of pillars of power in our society that finally decided they had enough of Trump and Trumpism, that all the warning signs were already there. And there was a sort of either active enabling or passive look the other way, kind of, hopefully this will go away. But just to go back to your first question, how did we get here, and tech's role? I think it's really important to recognize that these conditions have been building for decades. We have a crisis of trust. It started roughly around Vietnam and Watergate, when the long-standing level that Americans had of trust in their government took a crash, and it has never fully recovered. Maybe a little bit after 9/11, but never fully recovered. Then you get the rise of an alternative media system that Breitbart is just the latest example of. It goes back to right-wing talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, and Fox News, and Rupert Murdoch deciding that this was a very profitable thing to harvest the paranoia and racism of a large chunk of our society. And then our two-party system, which amplifies the power of small groups in both parties to dominate the national discourse. We do not tend towards the middle, we tend towards the extremes because of the two-party duopoly. And then you get a sociopathic narcissist who is a TV celebrity, who gets a tremendous amount of free attention from television in his campaign in 2015, 2016. And we should remember, it was people who ran CNN and CBS who said, Trump may be bad for the country, but he's really good for our ratings.
So actually on that note, a couple of things.
That's where we get, and then ad tech, and then ad tech.
Let's get back to ad tech later in the next point. So what happened if we'd have a left-leaning star, say George Clooney, and you also then had $16 billion spent on an election? do we think we might have ended up in a similar position? Not maybe the violence, but the polarization. Are we dissatisfied because it was Trump leaning right versus, say, George Clooney leaning left? I mean, is it the mechanics that are wrong or the candidate?
I heard that, just to jump in, that if the Democrats wanted to win, they should have run Tom Hanks, because there's this perception that he's a man you could trust. And that gets back to this idea of how perception is so much more important. But and when you think about that, it's all because of, you know, the roles he played on television shows, or movies rather, I'm sorry. And it's to me, it's just such a sad state on.
I'm sorry, I disagree. I think Trump, in a fragmented society, Trump uniquely, by basically blowing out the dog whistles and actually saying things blatantly that were racist, etc., he grabbed the single largest chunk that is available, which is about a third of the country that is just hardcore, Christian, nationalist, you know, etc., believe all the crazy things that we can mention. The Democratic coalition is more fractured. It is a lot harder for the Democrats to put together a majority in this system. So I don't think the analogy quite works. I don't think you can get the same dynamic with the celebrity on the left.
Well, let's move on. Let's come back to that later. Richard, you've been involved in DC. You were almost there when the riots were happening. Firstly, would you vote for President Hanks? And what's your view? I mean, how the hell has this happened? Have we just always been, has it just been a racist country for a long time and this is how things are?
Well, my view is a little different. I don't think that it's about as much about racism as it is about racial insensitivity. I think that a far greater percentage of people are racially insensitive, and when you have dialogue with friends, family, and extended family, and so forth, of different ethnicities and so forth, it comes out quite clearly that people have some pretty strong views. I actually go back and forth with my fiance about this very point, because I'm of the opinion that a large part of what we're seeing is actually dovetailing on something that Bruce said earlier, which is that what we're seeing is the manifestation of people's hubris, right? It's that I picked somebody and I don't want to be wrong. And so my company is giving people actionable data to figure out who should I vote for, right? Based on who actually fits me best and who will actually represent us as a people the best. You would think that it's in all our collective interest to know that information and to want to have it, digest it, utilize it for the benefit of voting intelligently and so forth. But what our data has actually shown is that it's actually more important, or that people seem to be more tied to their first the first thought that they had, which is, I support this candidate and I'm not backing off of that, and come hell or high water. It took the events of January 6th to actually get us to the point where people are saying, Jesus, I didn't expect this to happen. I mean, I think fairly, nobody expected anybody to actually take the Capitol, right? However, I think they did, because they went there with, they found within a half mile pipe bombs, Molotov cocktails, ammunition, guns, and so forth. So this whole thing was definitely planned out, and far more credit goes to those who actually, all the things that went into the planning of that very deeply. And then you have our president saying, I'll lead the effort to get there, right? Was he in the know on all of the other bad stuff? I don't know, but I gotta say that that people just tying their position to a thought that they initially had about a candidate, whether it be Tom Hanks or Donald Trump, I think we can all agree that he's a unique individual. I don't think that there are many other celebrities that would have done, even with an extreme left view.
True, true. But do you think the events of the 6th are a turning point, or do you think it's the new Columbine, where something horrific, the worst thing that happens, but nothing actually changes?
I think that at this point, I think that well, you know, I'm in the democracy reform business. So to your point, I'm anxious to see, we're getting more activity on Vote Our Voice now. And it's made that business of providing transparency and accountability in government, again, through technology, which is the point of this, this webinar today. Whether or not people actually use it to make the change, because one of the points that we've been making to people through our social media outlets is that quit making the change about the candidates that we voted for. The change has to come from us, the people who actually put these people in office. We're the change. We must change in aggregate as a people, not expect our representatives that are a small representation of what we want. So we have to actually change, and they are just a reflection of our values and so forth. And that's where the change actually has to come for. But people are, you know, again, I think Bruce made this point, people are inherently somewhat lazy in a way that they want someone else to be the change agent.
Mm. Okay, so on that very note, let's get on to the second question. Bad or enabling technology? It seems like Trump was certainly the internet president. He was most certainly the Twitter president. Twitter has now banned him for either next week or a permanent ban. Facebook has done the same. YouTube had just said the same. Is it time for regulation? Are publishing platforms really media companies? And we talked about media, money in politics, but is this the gasoline on the fire that's accelerating everything? Tristan, why don't we jump back to you? And I think you had some wider points as well.
Yeah, I think, well, before we talk about the specifics of what can be done, I think it's good to take a step back. I've actually been worrying about the power that the internet had in terms of enabling Trump and enabling what has come to pass since the election, because I was involved in building some of those tools, and I was kind of terrified by the fact that the tools that we built with a well-meaning intent of creating an internet president who would be enlightened by the populace turned to be this. And from there, I think I found that there's kind of 7 overall components, what I call kind of the 7 deadly sins of the internet and the 7 common virtue of the internet, and they cut both ways. The first one is we decided that the internet should be anonymous, right? And so that's good because it can protect vulnerable populations or at-risk individuals. But that's also terrible because it allows people to hide and use that to destroy. Then we thought that the internet could get rid of the printing press, right, and allow for that power of amplification for anyone to be out there. And that optimizes the distance travel by hate speech, unfortunately, and it speeds up the potential there. But it also allows the previously voiceless to have a voice. In the same way, the idea of free access, right, and carrying no penalty for giving information also creates room for creating mass disinformation with no penalty for creating that mass disinformation. All those things have created some basic conditions for what was called truthiness, which is basically lying, right, ultimately. But taking it one step away from an actual truth and going further and further from the truth, apply then the layer of the filter bubble, which is great in terms of creating communities of interest and getting people from all over the world that have a similar interest together, but also terrible.
I'll ask you one question actually on your bubble.
Yeah.
Have you retreated into your bubble further?
So I
surrounded yourself by people who are, let's say, rational, intelligent, and agree with you. And how much do you venture outside that bubble?
So I actually actively pierce through my filter bubble on a regular basis. I'm very deliberate in eating a media diet that is kind of broad. I'll watch Fox News as well as watching MSNBC. To me, they're the same channel. Really, at the end of the day, they're just presenting their political view of the same event. What filters from being able to look at those two things is that if both of them are agreeing on something, you know that's an actual fact. Yeah, but they seldom agree on anything.
Let's Bruce. Are you doing the same thing, or are your students doing the same thing? Are you having to push people into challenging their views, their worldviews?
I do. I think as Jess said, like I like to use Twitter as kind of a filter to go to trusted sources, but also, as she said, you go to Fox, which I do, and try, and I believe in debating. Let me try to take the opposite or channel my inner fill in the blank here. But it's so repulsive. You leave, and if the model is to make money, you want to engage people, tell them what they want to hear, keep them active. So you're going to feed them what they want to hear to reinforce, the echo chamber type of thing. With students, I do. I mean, one thing I try to do is just make sure that they read sites or newspapers or whatnot outside the United States, for one thing. But yeah, challenging people's belief is tough. You asked about, and I think, the point that was made with Micah, that, people, once you get attached to someone, you don't leave. I was surprised to read today that, like, Ken Langone, who was a major donor, the reason I didn't shop at Home Depot. Oh, now I love my politics. He changed his mind. He said, I was completely wrong. I'm going to do everything I can to make Biden the most successful president. But it's so rare that people will do that. And just very quickly on the Tom Hanks analogy, yes, Trump has 38% of the people, those same people that believe that the moon landing never happened. But you got to remember, our national elections are, 100,000 people in 5 states. That's if one football stadium changed their mind from one to the other, that's the national election. And what happens is, I think in the last election, is that people were so turned off by the Democratic candidate that they just didn't vote. And I think we're so much more closely divided than you would think. People thought this last election, how can more than a third of the country vote for this person? And it's down to 100,000 people.
Jess, are you seeing the same thing that?
Actually, Oliver, before you move on to the point, I want to make a plug. It's not an organization that I'm connected to, but there is a great site called Memorandum, MEMORANDUM, which encapsulate actually the whole political spectrum when it comes to political news. So I wanted to, as you're talking about the bubble, if people actually want to break through some of their bubble and start taking the steps, this is a good first step for them to take.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much. Very useful. Jess, are you seeing in your data, are you seeing a shift, or are people still very much tied to a single ideal or a single voting issue?
I would say, as somebody who's building technology, we're not so much on the ground. So our kind of information and my perspective is filtered through the on the ground groups that we do work with, who are either colleges or nonprofits or progressive advocacy groups. And we're actually nonpartisan, but when you think about it in practice, who's going to invest in tools that increases voter turnout are groups that benefit from more underrepresented people turning out. So our experience and our data this cycle, certainly we don't track who people vote for, but really a lot of focus on getting Trump out of office was the overall theme of anyone I worked with this cycle.
Are politicians following what you do? Or to put it another way, are they starting to be aware of shifting sentiment and the data and the approaches you're talking about? Or is it still you're talking to the converted? Does City Hall, do you have a good conversation with City Hall every now and again?
I've never spoken to.
Right, I'll make an introduction then, because this should be happening. Okay, fantastic. Misha, enabling technologies, do you think it's time for regulation? I mean, the end result has been the storming of the White House. Is this the line in the sand, or is it just business as usual?
Well, I'm not sure I would connect the need for regulation to specifically the storming of the Capitol. I mean, there are different issues in the regulatory arena. One has to do with antitrust and whether just the sheer power of 4 or 5 mega platforms. I'm glad that Twitter, finally deplatformed Trump after so many violations of their own terms of service. And at the same time, I don't think any of us want that decision to be in the hands of 2 or 3 tech bros.
Actually, maybe I'll not say regulation. Do you think instead it'd be better to call them publishing platforms, and then that has its own set of regulations about what you can.
I mean, the thing is that, the way media law works, there are different obligations that, different services may have. We have, cable, for example, is handled differently than others. I mean, so part of it is the media law landscape itself is fragmented. I do think from the standpoint of how the big tech platforms they've tried to stay away from the fact that they are publishing platforms that are constantly making editorial judgments. I mean, for years, Mark Zuckerberg made an editorial judgment about Facebook, which is he didn't want people to see nudity, right? I should correct that. Female,
yes, exactly.
Right, as opposed to male above the waist. That's an editorial judgment. It's also a business judgment, but it clearly, and it was a bad one because it probably hurt the breastfeeding movement, among other things. But no one, was able to convince him that meant he really was a publisher who needed to have editorial team of people who make editorial judgments. Instead, the theory is that the algorithm, the AI is doing this, and it isn't humans. Of course it's humans.
Of course it's humans, yes, absolutely.
So once you recognize that, then we can try, in the best case scenario, you get ethical leadership that recognizes, in the same way that the publisher of the New York Times is constantly making these kinds of judgments with his senior leadership team, that you do the same thing with these platforms. And when you finally see the outcome, which is Facebook contributing to genocide in Myanmar, I mean, maybe then they'll finally hire people who can speak the local languages to help them make content moderation decisions in a timely way. But it shouldn't have taken that long. That's
so let me ask you the pointed question. Do you use Facebook? Have you got an account? Are you on there?
Of course I have to use Facebook. It's like saying, can you avoid where the majority of people are? And I work in the field of, the intersection of tech and politics. I need to understand how these tools work. Do I spend money on Facebook as someone who would be one of their true customers? I try not to. I find it offensive that Facebook colonized my personal social network and turned around and said, well, you want to reach all of them? Here, pay us.
Absolutely.
That's not something that we should have allowed to have happen.
Richard, I'm going to ask you the same question. Firstly, do you use Facebook? Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Do you think you can get away from it, or do you think they should change? Do you think it's where do you sit on this?
Well, as a what's probably timely to tell everybody at this time, you probably may have seen my phone from time to time while I'm doing it. That's because I am actually streaming our discussion, our webinar, on TikTok Live. So everybody here is being streamed. We've got hundreds of people on our TikTok channel that have tapped into this webinar as we're doing this. So it's just one way. We've got about 31,000 plus on TikTok. On Facebook, we have just under 1.3 million followers, and that we've actually been able to convert to users on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're now growing that, putting a lot of capital into that as a company that has built a substantial platform on Facebook. I have given Mark Zuckerberg a lot of money.
So would you say you're trying to use the platform? Obviously, you're trying to use the platform for good.
Yes.
Is it a sort of necessary evil, or is it a case of, no, look, that's where people are, so that's where you need to be?
It is both a necessary evil and where they are, because the biggest problem I have with Facebook is that we're really a data science company. We're trying to give people data and we are truly nonpartisan. We're not trying to influence people, but because the title of our company is Vote Our Voice, we get lumped into a political organization like, and all of our ads are deemed political. So, we went through a period where, maybe 9 months we were off Facebook. We were not able to run Facebook ads just because we couldn't get anything approved, all the vetting. I mean, it's crazy what they put us through. But at this point, we're able to impact a lot of people on this particular form. We're trying to navigate away from just using that to doing more on YouTube, as well as going to, we're on Reddit. We've got Snapchat. Everything that you can imagine, we're using, and we'll find an environment or a group and meet them where they are, so that they can understand. They can find out a little bit about us, and they can also see that it can be a benefit to them, and it's just a good social benefit. So that's what we're doing.
Fantastic. Well, let's on exactly that note. Let's talk about good technologies, good companies. What's out there that's good, that could help US democracy? What's working in other countries that could be imported? And what would you like to see happen? Maybe a change of the law, a change of attitude. What's a thought of where we could be? Tristan.
Yeah, so the first thing, when we're talking about regulation and talking about Section 230 and how we got there, let's not forget that regulation is how we got there. The reason Section 230 existed, or it still exists, is that people prior to Section 230 were getting sued for controlling the content on their online services. I think Prodigy and CompuServe had gotten sued at the time, and that's why Section 230 was written into the Communication Decency Act and remained the only provision to stay in there. But coming from the same location is the fact that the Supreme Court gave us First Amendment protection when it comes to the internet, and made sure that we weren't as regulated as television or even the printing world. So when talking about regulation, I'd say be very careful about what you want because it will have unintended consequences. Now, from a technology standpoint, I think people tend to forget there is this thing called the web. You know, it's like it's an open network where there isn't necessarily a heavy concentration of individuals in one particular area, and where that aggregation is actually one of the issues that we're trying to deal with. Because the reason people have given that much power to Facebook, to Twitter, you know, name your social platform today, to TikTok increasingly, is because that's where a lot of people are concentrating. And that's where advertisers go and throw their money to buy that product, the eyeballs of the people that are coming there. The web, because it is distributed in its nature, actually creates some level of diffusion. And as a result, it may not necessarily be as strong in terms of broadcasting to a wide audience very quickly, not as efficient as, say, putting something on Facebook. But it also, because it is not as efficient, it becomes kind of a check gate to disinformation or things along.
So you're suggesting it's really a self-correcting system where if you do good, there will be good.
Yeah, I mean, if you think, right, there's a number of points of controls to the internet. When you think about it from a technology standpoint, and Parler has certainly learned, right, that those points of control exist. The first one for most people on their mobile phone is the App Store. There's only 2 App Stores in the United States. You go to China, just in the Google environment, you've got over 200 App Stores. So you start telling Apple and Google that they must allow other App Stores on their tech, that changes the overall dynamics about creating those points of control. The second layer is the telcos. I mean, today, the concentration in telecommunication across largely 3 mobile providers create another layer of access when it comes to the internet, where basically Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile can decide to shut down anyone. People don't think about them, but they are gatekeepers as much as the rest of those companies. And last but not least are the underlying infrastructure from a hosting standpoint. So people have learned that in the last few days, probably more broadly, that Amazon may be a strong retail business, but really is a large infrastructure player with their Amazon Web Services infrastructure. There's only 3 or 4 of those companies. Microsoft and Google are the other 2 big ones in that space. There's a couple of other more, but they really control a large layer of access.
Exactly, and actually they did shut down Parler, or rather shut down hosting, so they should be up and running pretty quickly. Bruce, do we think we have gatekeepers in reality? I mean, do you think there's something that better needs to be done, or do you think it's just a self-correcting system?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think it's self-correcting, and that's why we got to where we are here. I was waiting for the Facebook question because Mark's dad, Ed, was my dentist, and the practice was at his house. So I grew up with Mark when he set up his little thing, so his mother didn't have to page the dentist to come down. But anyway, you know, one thing with the last election, I thought it was in media, how do we get rid of or reduce the KKK's growth after World War II? And it was this guy, Stetson Kennedy, who was a writer for Superman, who decided to expose all the KKK silliness and have the kids go around and play cowboys and Indians, but kill KKK people and make fun of them and mock them. And it was that perception change that saw this dramatic increase right after World War II to flat. Or Dr. Seuss did that a little bit with the Nazis. You know, again, it's, you know, how do you reach people and how do you get that belief or that feel when people aren't that interested in critical thinking, facts and all that? The whole thing with Trump, you know, and the reality shows, like, you know, The Apprentice, the woman to his left was the bartender when I lived in Dobbs Ferry at the local bar. She just looked the part. And that's what people wanted to believe. And, you know, maybe we have to go to where they are. And, you know, that old expression, the median is the message, you know, McClure. I think sometimes we overthink it. We just have to meet people where their gut is.
Well, could you mention a couple of things that you're liking? You know, good media, good coverage, technologies which are going to make us more democratic and more inclusive and kinder.
If you look at technologies, I mean, will there be technology that people could trust? So one thing that comes to mind, you know, extemporaneously, is like this DNA evidence. You know, if someone says, well, the DNA evidence showed that, you know, there's one chance in 346 million or billion, that seems to be believed. Now, there's a lot of other things. There's a lot of forensics. I worked in forensic firearms analysis, and it was silly, but DNA, people believe. Are there technologies that people will believe? So, you know, with voter ID, I think there's a lot in biometrics, you know, zero knowledge proof that could be trusted. I don't want to throw out technology names like blockchain. It would be great for voting, for verification. I don't think people will trust it. I think I went to a recent presentation in Sweden. Well, it wasn't that recent, it was before COVID. The use of like data visualizations. You know, people believe a picture, or, you know, why are we having a reaction? In Sandy Hook, if people showed all those little kids blown to bits by guns, we would have acted. There was no pictures or movies. The Capitol, we saw the pictures and movies. So if we could use technology to draw pictures and movies, you know, that people believe. So last thing, very quickly, spring break, when COVID started, they used the cell phone tracking to show all these people going to South, you know, Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and then traveling throughout the whole country. If you could use technology in a way that, again, hits people in the gut and they believe it because it feels right, I think that's where we have to aim.
I'm going to push back on Bruce's point here.
No, please.
And part of the reason I disagree that technology has a silver bullet or a series of silver bullets is that the more fundamental problem here is that we don't even have agreement as to what the truth is anymore. Right? And that is not something that technology can solve.
Jess,
and that was my point.
Although, actually, let's move on to Jess. It seems like the perfect segue.
Oliver, I'm going to interrupt everyone. Hi, sorry, organizer, just interfering. Just if everyone's looking at the chat, there's been a lot of really interesting stuff being said, and we're going to address all of that on the Fireside Chat. But if you have, you can keep putting your questions down in the chat, and we'll address them next week at our follow-up. Sorry, Oliver, go ahead.
Jess, it seems like exactly what you're doing is improving trust through technology. It seems like that's the end result of the platform, the work you're doing, and so on.
Well, yes and no. We started with a goal of helping folks bridge what we call an intention action gap in voting, right? Which is there's so many reasons why people don't vote, and not to say voting is the only shape that democratic participation looks like, but it's the most visible for a lot of us, where people don't vote because they face what we call micro barriers. I got busy, I missed the deadline, I didn't know, and these are especially salient in lower information elections. So I actually, in a way, like to keep our purview pretty narrow, because when you think about what is a tool that can help something, you have to think, what are you trying to help, right? And is it depression, right? And you need to be in deep therapy, or is it that you need, kind of like a pump up and a cheer up session, right? I think I would never say that what we're doing in terms of equipping voters with sort of more common sense, more user-friendly ways to navigate a complicated system, right? Like that that in a way over time can, yes, help build the muscle of participation and help build trust and familiarity. And our goal is that civic engagement is a habit, and there's not a whole to do, and there's not billions of dollars spent every year to try to get people, like, you just do it, right? You don't always feel like it, but you just do it. Very much like going to the gym in that sense. But like in terms of what we were talking about at the beginning of this session, right, around misinformation and, you know, deep division and distrust, making sure people, right, like submit their absentee ballot request form on time, right? That's not what we're doing. So I think what we're doing is playing one important piece in helping make the democratic process something that is more digestible and accessible and fits the way that people live. But I certainly don't think it's the solution for.
No, of course. Over the last year, what has been the thing that your platform has helped the most with? And then what's the thing that you would like to see more progress over the next year?
Yeah, so vote by mail this year, as everyone realized that we were going to have to shift away from the process that most people were used to. So vote by mail is something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. There's a lot of procedural process steps, and it also, it bumps the timeline of voter engagement and get out the vote much earlier. So I was really proud of my team's pivot to ensuring that our platform could effectively walk people through the vote by mail process with nudges and reminders and really clear bite-sized information, given, right, that, you know, we don't have one presidential election, we have 50 state elections, and some of them were changing their laws and their deadlines right up until the final minute. So I think that's one piece that I'm proud of, and not just in my work, but more broadly in the space, everyone really jumped in to make sure that people could understand a process that has a lot of micro barriers built into it. What I'd like to see is voting as something, and conversations about voting as something that is less transactional, right? There's sort of the stereotype of national campaigns and consultants parachuting in every 4 years. And that's what helps seeds this idea of like distrust in politicians. They just want my vote, but they don't really care about me. They're gonna come knock me before and then disappear. And when we had this huge surge of volunteers who for the first time were able to organize in a distributed and remote way, which is really powerful, right? Like volunteers in California can be calling voters in Georgia and texting voters in Georgia, and you no longer are constrained by the physical constraints of having to go into an office. So I think we saw that we could really scale up voter to voter and volunteer efforts in a new way. And we started to prove that out as a space, but how do we make it something that is not simply, you know, transactional and one way? Because again, that's part of the reason why we lack trust, is because of that lack of continuity and community in our communications about voting and democracy, when we see it just as a means to an end.
Fantastic, thank you. Michelle, let's carry on with trust. I mean, is trust the new currency? And what things have you seen that you've really liked that are positive, that increase civic engagement?
Sure. Let me first say I'm a big fan of Jess's project, and I love how closely they have focused on solving one problem, which is particularly how you get young people to be more civically engaged and paying attention to specific sort of psychological and environmental nudges and things you can do. So sometimes it's about breaking the problem into more manageable pieces. My favorite example of a platform approach to civic engagement is a company called Front Porch Forum in Vermont, which has now been around for 20 years. It's a small for-profit. They have about 20 employees, and they have about 3/4 of the households in Vermont belong to one of their neighborhood forums. These are online bulletin boards, basically, that where once you are a verified resident, you can receive these digests once a day, and it is neighbors sharing news with neighbors. Their mission statement is, our mission is to help neighbors connect and build community. And they know, in fact, they've done some third-party studies. They have found that participation in one of these forums increases trust in not just people trusting their neighbors, increases trust in their elected officials, increases their interest in both local and state government. And by the way, they use paid moderators. This is key. I mean, there are a lot of things that they've done to design to enhance civic trust.
Do you think this could work in, say, New York City, where it feels like neighborhoods are collections of people who don't necessarily talk to each other? You don't necessarily talk to your neighbor as much as you should.
It's a more complicated problem in New York, obviously, but the truth is that New York City is a city of neighborhoods. As someone who's lived here a long time, I can say that, but we have a lot of people coming and going. It's a challenge. And no question that what has worked in Vermont and been built up slowly, we have a different situation in urban areas, but I don't think Nextdoor, which has come in very quickly with venture capital, is solving the problem at all. I think they tend to enhance distrust because of, they don't use paid moderators. So the volunteer moderators on a Nextdoor forum are whoever managed to get 30 users first. And a lot of what we see on Nextdoor is amplification of distrust. Same thing with Amazon's Ring, network. So it can be done, but a lot of it is about making these critical design choices from the beginning.
Fantastic, thank you. Richard, it can be done. How do you think we can get there? What's a small step we can all take? We've got 4 minutes left, so you have some of the last words.
Okay, in terms of buying trust, one of the things with our technology is we give our users something that are using that are engaging with VoteOurVoice. You have incentive to engage in technology, and your engagement gives you a personalized report card about the politician. So you have no incentive to lie about what it is that you're seeking. So if you're looking for information about how a particular candidate may feel about abortion, about climate or clean energy, or whatever your buzz topic is, you can find that topic by topic. You get aggregate information. You also get information on both senators and your congressional representative. But what we saw, like in this last election, it's not perfect because, and Cory Gardner as a representative in Colorado is a great example. Cory Gardner had represented the people of Colorado 83% of the time. So 83% of the people who vote there actually agreed with the way that this guy voted in office and he was voted out of office. It's not likely that's going to be replicated by the next person going in because he was number 5 out of 100 senators, right? So our whole mantra is to try and get people to use data over party loyalty or emotion. So if we can get people to do that, then what we'll see is people migrating towards a more data-driven environment that can breed trust because you're just using numbers that are not falsified, but are, in a lot of times are generated by the very users that are participating with the various platforms.
Information is power. Well, we are almost at time. Do please come back next week where the fantastic fireside chat will happen with Bruce, where he will answer audience questions and dig into some of these topics a lot more. Just before we wrap up, I'll get everyone to say how they're thinking about next year. So what's one word that sums up how you're thinking 2021 might go? Tristan, what's your word of the year?
I think the return to stability.
Fantastic. Bruce, how about you?
Vaccine?
Vaccine, okay, okay. Probably against many things. Jess?
Unknown.
Sorry, what was that?
Unknown. It was a cop-out answer.
Okay, okay. Micah?
Rebuilding.
Rebuilding, fantastic. And Richard, what's your word of the year?
My word of the year be unity.
Unity, brilliant. Well, that feels like a good positive note to finish on. So it's 7 o'clock. Thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists, for your words and wisdom. Thank you so much.
See you next week. Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Thanks.